Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Book Club. And usually I would be saying our Thoughts Determine Our Lives book club, but tonight we are having a special. And so I have our special speaker tonight, Aaron. Aaron Michael Nielson is
Hello.
a I'll let Aaron actually introduce himself in a minute, but first I just want to kind of give a quick disclaimer that this is not my office, and it's not usually I would be at the bookstore for our book club, but I am not at the bookstore because it's closed down right at the moment, and I also am having my office what do you call it? Not really remodeled, but just kind of renovated and fixed up. So my office is off limits as well at the moment. So I'm borrowing somebody else's office today. So
Hey, it's great that you had that.
yes, exactly. I'm super grateful. So yeah, I am glad to be here. But Aaron, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us about Aaron has asked to come here tonight, and I'm so excited to have him. He is going to tell us all about Jane Austen and the wonderful world of Jane Austen. And I am super excited, Aaron, because I have to tell you that throughout my life, I have only read Jane Austen novels when I was forced to by someone else. And I have never in my own self found it to enjoy them. So I can't wait to have you correct me on this and help me find the joy and especially find Christ in these novels. Yeah. I just can't wait to learn about this. So take it away, Aaron.
Yeah, so I'm Aaron Nielson, and I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm a Lutheran, so a bit of a heretic from a lot of your perspective, but that's all right. We Kevin and I have become wonderful friends through the internet, and I appreciate his love of Christ. So that's Amen. Something we can relate over. I had this idea to have
Aaron,
this.
Go ahead. Just as far as you being a heretic, the irony is that when it comes to the book club, actually, I was just talking to somebody the other day, and I realized that every single person in the book club who participates regularly are all ex-Protestants.
Wow.
And when they started attending, with I think the exception of one woman, when people started attending, all of them were Protestants when they started attending the book club. So from their perspective, you at least when they started attending, they wouldn't have considered you a heretic. Now all of them are obviously Orthodox because that's what we do. But but
the Lord's work, man.
Praise God. But so I just wanted to give you that disclaimer that
good. But you guys understand me, right?
That's right. Nobody here is judging you. Nobody here is judging you.
Yeah. So so I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm married. I have 5 children here on earth, 2 that the Lord has seen fit to take, and we're very blessed with our community here, and I love it. And one of the things that has been very encouraging to me is that we've gotten to do English country dancing. It's a new thing that we've been doing at our church the last couple of years, and such a fun community thing. And this ties right into Jane Austen novels. These are, the lady that teaches us the dances, she'll be watching the movies and she'll be like, okay, write that down. Okay. So they spin and then they, great. Okay. I'm going to teach that, next time. So it's great. So we have a great time. So I had this idea a few weeks ago. I said, hey, what if we talked about Jane Austen novels? This would be weird for a few reasons. One, not a lot of people talk about like the Christian themes that are in Jane Austen novels, because we usually see them as like romance novels. The other thing that I thought would be fun is we're 2 guys talking about Jane Austen novels.
Exactly.
And I fully believe that men would benefit from reading Jane Austen novels. Now, hear me out here. All right. I started reading them. I'm married to my wife. We've been married for 12 years coming up this summer. And I thought, you know what? My wife loves these books. In fact, she and her friends, they used to write like fan fictions together. And they put themselves in the stories and that sort of a thing. She loves these books, right? And so I thought, you know what? this is an aspect of my wife's life that I'm not a part of, and I would like to be a part of that. I'd like to join in that with her. And so I started reading it on that much. And, just like you, I actually was never forced to read them. But Jane Austen books, especially like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, these are ones that are typically on your 100 books that everyone needs to read sort of list. So you might have been forced to read them in high school, maybe college, that sort of a thing. I was never forced to read them, but I was aware of them.
Right.
And so I wasn't really expecting to really enjoy them, but then I really enjoyed them. And I enjoyed them for a number of reasons here. So, a lot of kind of modern fiction, there isn't a lot of masculinity, like good, solid masculinity. You get that in Jane Austen books. You and I are kind of feudalists. You get that in Jane Austen books, right? And one of the things that's really interesting, actually, just about the time in which Jane Austen's writing, is that you sort of have this sort of end of the kind of Middle Ages, medieval era.
Right.
You still see that. You've got the estates, you've got the nobility, that sort of thing. These are all aspects of the book, but it's shifting into modernity, right? Something people don't. Right. Something people don't think about is that like the horse and carriage is actually modernity. Henry VIII was like one of the first kings to actually ride in a coach. Before that, they didn't really do that, right? So these are all things we're starting to industrialize and that sort of thing. And these are themes that you actually see coming out in Jane Austen. And what she does is she uses the structure of the nobility and the houses and stuff like that to sort of talk about these disparities, right? And so you have a number of these certain things. The other thing that I really like, and as I was reading these books, there's a particular festival, church festival, that shows up in almost every book, and I found that really interesting. And the festival is Candlemas, which we just celebrated recently,
right?
And then the other one is Michaelmas, which is in the fall, which is the feast of Saint Michael and All Angels.
Right.
These, of course, Western festivals. You may celebrate them at different times. In England, though, going back over 1,000 years, these were two very important festivals. And I learned this from reading this book because these two festivals often serve as kind of a pivot point within the story. And I always thought that's weird. There must be something very specific. Like maybe Jane Austen had a special devotion to St. Michael or to St. Mary. I don't know. And so I looked into this, and it's actually very fascinating and paints a really interesting picture about what the world is like for the medieval mind in the modern era, right? So we need to keep this in mind, that these books, even though they're 200 plus years old, she was writing 1811, that sort of a thing. So kind of the Napoleonic era, that sort of a thing. This is modernity, right? And so seeing this sort of medieval mindset kind of hold over into modernity is actually really fascinating to me, because to me, you and I did like a 3-hour episode of your Freed Indeed show a few months ago about building community and that sort of a thing. The community that you see in Jane Austen has a lot of beautiful structure to it. It's got this holdover of the class structure that you have from the Middle Ages that you still have a little bit of in England today, but much less. And in Jane Austen's day was already decreasing. But then you also have kind of community based around the church. And you see this in references in her books to like Candlemas and Michaelmas being kind of pivot points in her story, right? The reason they're pivot points in her story is because those are pivot points in the Christian year for the people of that time, and pretty much for like the previous 1,000 years. And we can get into that more so beforehand. I don't know how many of your viewers have read them. They're 200-year-old books, so I'm not terribly worried about spoilers. If we spoil things, I'm sorry. Go and read them. You've had your chance. They're wonderful. They're wonderful books. If you don't feel like reading a 400-page book, there's manga editions that I actually got.
Wow.
I got Pride and Prejudice for my wife recently, the manga edition, and she actually really enjoyed it. There were some things she didn't like about it, but she was like, it was a pretty faithful adaptation. There's all sorts of movie adaptations of it. Some are better than others. A lot of them are
also like fan
very
fictions,
good.
like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies,
which is actually a fantastic kind of rendition of it. I did a post about this when I first watched it a year or so ago, It was actually a pretty close one. And it just sort of like the zombies are just sort of an annoyance, which I don't know. It's just kind of fun. There is some, in that particular rendition, there is some sacrilege in there. I'll just warn you of that. There's a little bit of mockery of the Blessed Sacrament from the zombies' perspective. So it's like the villains are doing it. So, whatever. But
yeah, so that's like a little bit that's more palpable, right?
Right. So, but anyway, no, that one, I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was silly. It was fun. I haven't read that book. It's, the movie was based off of a book. The movie was fun. That sort of a thing. But let's dig into kind of some of the stories that you have there. So the general theme of all of Jane Austen's books is that she's doing sort of a class commentary, but she's not doing it in like the Marxist way where it's like, oh, the bourgeoisie, they're doing this sort of thing. No, what she's doing is that when it comes to the class structure, especially in England, which is very kind of honor-based, actually at that time it's kind of more of a shame-based culture, right? So there were a lot of things that you just sort of did because if you didn't, it would be shameful, right? Now this just as a structure for a society can be really interesting. We don't really have a shame-based culture in America anymore. We have no shame.
Right.
And I think you're seeing kind of the downfall of this, especially like in the discussions you and I have had about like the state of the economy and that sort of a thing. Because we don't really have shame in and of ourselves, I think we kind of struggle to see our own flaws. And this is something Jane Austen kind of touches on. A lot of times the heroes or the heroines in her story spend a lot of the story making mistakes and doing things wrong and being completely unaware of it. And other people see this, and it's shameful that they would do this.
Right.
But because there's this idea of shame, there are specific rules that they follow. And because they're following those rules, the whole community is better off. Right. So because it's a shame-based culture, there's a structure there that like our modern society doesn't really have. And so a lot of, you and I, we kind of touched on earlier, you and I are kind of feudalists. So I like this. I like that there's a class structure. You can see this in like TV shows like Downton Abbey and that sort of a thing. There's a class structure. And I love like right in the first season, the Matthew Crowley comes in and he, has not grown up in this world, but he becomes the heir to this, this abbey. And so he comes in and he's like, well, I don't need someone to come help me get dressed every morning. And he really offends the valet who is supposed to do that. And the butler has to come to him and he's like, look, it's your job to give this person an honorable duty. He wants to serve you. That's what God has given him to do. It's your duty to give him that job. And so that really changes his perspective of like, okay, me being available to be served is also providing a meaningful existence to this person. Right.
Exactly.
And then you get other, so there was, Sherlock Holmes. It was like about Sherlock Holmes' sister or something like that. It wasn't a great movie. It was on Netflix, whatever. Came out a few years ago.
Millie?
Yes. The one with Millie Bobby Brown. It was fine. It was a fun movie, but it wasn't great. And it's like totally feminist, but there's this one part there. And unfortunately you find out she's the villain, but there's this one part there where Millie Bobby Brown's character is like, I don't understand. Why do you have this big house and that sort of a thing? Like, what's the whole point of it? There's this, they kind of set it around this sort of House of Lords reform in the early 20th century and that sort of a thing. And so she's like, what's the point of it or whatever? And the older woman who's, I forget what her name is or whatever, but she's like 70 years old and she's kind of the matriarch of the house. She says, we were given this land as stewards. And it's our duty to make sure that the Industrial Revolution doesn't destroy this country. This is the territory that God has given us. And I don't know if she uses God language or whatever, but this was kind of the connotation. God has given us this land, and it's our duty to make sure that we preserve England for future generations. Right?
Oh, I love that.
I love it too, and that's why I was really sad she became the villain. Which of course she did. Of course, the movie made by modernists, but
of course, because they hate values,
right? But it was like the most beautiful kind of description of like what is the value of the nobility, right?
Right.
They are servants, they are stewards, right? They're not just rich people, right? So Jane Austen is able to make commentary on kind of the peculiar peculiarities of the class structure. And then also
Right.
you get a lot of people that are in these kind of upper classes that don't understand their stewardship.
Right.
And you see this. There's a word that comes up all the time in Jane Austen novels, and I love it. And I haven't yet gotten myself to like pepper it in daily life. But a lot of times men are referred to as coxcombs. Cock being, you know, like a chicken.
Right.
And the idea being is that they kind of, they're spendthrifts, is another word she likes to use a lot. They just sort of like, they like being rich. They like
Right.
having fancy stuff. They like impressing people with their fancy stuff. And that's how they live their life. And that's not what the nobility is for. They're stewards, right? So a lot of the times the characters that Jane Austen presents you with don't understand their God-given role as a steward of creation, this particular plot of creation. And this is why so like the heroine of the book, a lot of times will not be attracted to a man that's proposing to her because of that. Like she'll sense that about him. She might not like recognize that's what's off about him, but she'll kind of sense it. So Pride and Prejudice is probably like her most famous book. Like if you know, if you mention Jane Austen, everybody's going to be like Pride and Prejudice. Basic premise of Pride and Prejudice is that you have the Bennet family and Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. They're not nobility, but they've inherited this house. And he's been living there. And the general kind of philosophy of the time was that you want to have a male son so that you can pass that on to your son and it stays in your family. If you don't have a male son, in most situations, it would pass to like a cousin or, you know, the next, you know, the uncle or something like that. It would go to the next male in line and that sort of a thing. So Mr. Bennet just assumes he's going to have a son and doesn't really do a lot of putting money away for his daughters. Right. We'll get to that in a second because this becomes really important. He never has a son. He has 5 daughters and he never has a son. And so because he never prepared for his daughters, what you needed to do as a father in this sort of a world is you needed to put money away for your daughters. And then they would use that. This was their dowry. They would take that money and that would be added to their attractiveness. Right. Right. Because what they would do is they would take that money, they would put it into a savings account. They would withdraw from it 5% per year. And it was pretty stable. This system goes back like 500 years at least. Right.
Well, it goes back even further than that because that is also like even in biblical times, you see the dowries and it adds to a woman's kind of ability. It also affords protection to that woman because, you know, if it doesn't work out with the husband,
it's her
and
money.
He turns out to be like a serial killer, she can get out, and now she has, you know, in biblical times, she has a bunch of goats that she can then, you know, get out with and still survive.
That whole system is to protect the women. And you start seeing some kind of criticisms of that at this time, because one of the problems was if the dad was not good at saving this money and the woman didn't get married for some reason, or, you know, it didn't work out, or she was widowed or that sort of a thing, and so she no longer had her husband's money, that would be really, really hard for her. Right. And so we'll get to some characters that happens to kind of later on, but in Pride and Prejudice, he didn't do a good job saving this. So his daughters, though they're beautiful, though they are, you know, upper class, so they're respectable people, they're not very wealthy. Right. So they need to find someone that's willing to overlook that so that they continue living a good life. The mother becomes kind of obsessed with it. Well, not kind of. She becomes obsessed with it. Like it's the only thing that she thinks about, which is actually funny because a lot of the like teenage girls that read these books, they kind of become the same way. They become kind of obsessed with finding a mate. You know, that's right. And I think Jane Austen kind of intended you to read it that way. Like it intended to have that effect so that you would kind of be able to look back at it later and be like, oh, that was a little weird. Right. Because Mrs. Bennet is a weird character and she embarrasses the main character a lot. So Elizabeth is the oldest daughter. And so obviously she, you know, the hope is that she's going to get married soon. She's a little bit older than like your kind of normal age to like debut. Right. You know, So I think she's in her 20s at the time and that sort of a thing. So, like she's already kind of behind things, but this is because she kind of prefers reading books and being smart and that sort of a thing. And her mom's always like, oh no, you're embarrassing us. You should be out there, at the dances and looking pretty and, doing womanly crafts,
Right.
like playing piano and stuff like that. And her father, he just loves his daughter and he thinks she's brilliant. And he just, he really likes her. And he kind of realizes his wife's kind of dumb. And he sort of regrets, like he loves her, but he sort of is like, what if I had married someone that wasn't dumb? Like I clearly married her because she's beautiful and had a nice, inheritance. And, but I have like nothing in common with her.
Right.
And so that's kind of a dynamic that you have there. Elizabeth's a lot like her dad. A lot of her younger sister, she's got another sister, Jane, who is more mild-mannered. She's not like boy crazy. She's smart. She's talented. She's described as more beautiful than Elizabeth, that sort of a thing. And so she's there. And then the younger sisters are all boy crazy, but they're also young. They're young, like they're young teenagers. And so you kind of get that immaturity there.
Right.
The younger sisters and Mrs. Bennet being like that, because they're a lot more like their mother, really embarrass Elizabeth. Jane, you don't really know what she thinks about things, but I imagine she's fairly similar to Elizabeth, but maybe not to the same extent. Elizabeth is really, really embarrassed by them a lot of the time. So the kind of pivot in the story starts when Mr. Darcy, who, like if you're talking about you want to be the perfect man, everybody points to Mr. Darcy, which I think is a mistake, and we'll get to that in a later book. But he's a good man. He's fine. He makes £10,000 per year from his property. This is just rent that he makes. Like, you can call it tax. It's rent is what it is. This is the feudal system.
Right.
On top of that, whatever investments he has, usually at this time, the people they were starting to invest in some industrial things and that sort of a thing. So he got $10,000 a year just from his property. And then after that, so he was very wealthy. In today's dollars, that would be like a $2.5 million a year income. I mean, we're talking very wealthy. Just from passive income. He also had probably passive income sources or, active income sources as well. But this is just his passive income. Very attractive man, that sort of a thing. So he comes in.
He's a high value man in our modern terms.
He is. Now, Mr. Darcy is not noble, but his mother is. But because his mother is, and it wasn't his father that was noble, the noble title doesn't pass down to his generation.
Right.
Now, because he comes from a noble family, he could maybe start pressing some claims and that sort of a thing. That's a whole sort of concept. There's a great YouTube channel, Ellie Dashwood, Ellie Dashwood is the name of a character from Sense and Sensibility. But this woman has taken on this name, does a great job explaining all this. She talks about the economy of the time and that sort of a thing. If he really wanted to like receive a noble title, he probably could. He just would have to shake a few hands and that sort of a thing. And it would be a lot easier for him because he has these connections, right?
Right.
Then you have Mr. Darcy, because he has some of these other active income streams. He goes to London, does business, that sort of a thing. He's met some friends. And one of the friends that he meets is this man named Bingley, who I think is a better man than Darcy. But he's not kind of the main man of the story. But he's also very wealthy, not as wealthy as Darcy. He makes like £2,500 a year, which is still, we're talking like $700,000 a year. This is a very wealthy man, but not nearly as wealthy as Darcy is.
Right.
Bingley rents one of Darcy's houses.
Okay.
And so you have these two men here. You have two of the daughters that have debuted. You've got two more daughters that are kind of about to debut. You would do this at about like 16, 17. And there was this whole process for like, you would go, like the king or the queen would host these courts and the women would go and they'd be inspected. And then they would say, yes, you have our seal of approval. And then you're debuted, right? It is a whole big thing. So the mother is like, I'm getting older. My daughters aren't married yet. When my husband dies, because he's getting older, we're going to be kicked out of here because the estate's going to go to this man, Mr. Collins. We'll get to Mr. Collins in a bit because he's one of these coxcombs. So the mother starts getting really obsessed with like trying to get her daughters to like meet up with these guys and fall in love with them and get them to propose to them. She doesn't really even care if they fall in love with it. Like for her, it is literally just about the lifestyle.
Right.
Right. So we're seeing this kind of dysfunctional idea here. She doesn't see herself as a steward. Right. And one of the like the financial things that I didn't bring up earlier was that their property is encumbered. Right. So if it's encumbered, you can't sell any portion of it. And they do this to preserve the family property for generations.
Right.
And that's why he did it for thousands of years. Right. And he's upset about this because his dad actually made him sign an agreement before the story started to encumber the property. And he didn't think about it at the time because he assumed he was going to have a son, but then he never did. And now he's poor and he can't. One of the ways that you might be able to do that is you would mortgage off at least a portion of your property to get some cash. And then you would give that money to your daughters and that sort of thing. Well, he couldn't do that because he had agreed with his father that it would be encumbered. And so that goes for, I think, 3 generations. So he didn't have that available to him. They meet up with Bingley and Darcy and that sort of a thing. And Darcy is a lot of Jane Austen's characters, and a lot of people suspect Jane Austen herself are probably autistic.
Yeah.
and the reason they think this is because you have a lot of those standard, I don't read social cues very well. You have a very kind of strict sense of justice, that sort of a thing, which is where we get the title of the book. Elizabeth Bennet is prideful. She's the pride of the book, which is why she probably hasn't gotten married yet. She's like, well, I don't need that, right? She's not a feminist, but she's like, I don't need to just focus my life on finding a man. Right. I have qualities in and of myself. And at this time, pretty much the only thing that like a lot of people were focusing on the value of women was just something to be pretty and cute and to do cute things like cross-stitching, which cross-stitching is fine. But you could see a woman like Elizabeth, who's very smart, who can hold her own in a conversation with men and that sort of a thing, might be a little bit bothered by that. She's like, I want someone that appreciates me for these things and not just because I look cute, because she sees the dysfunction in her own parents' relationship.
Right, exactly.
So she meets Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy has grown up in this world with the autism. He knows the rules, right? He knows the protocols and that sort of thing. He knows what he's supposed to be looking for. He sees Elizabeth and he's prejudiced against her. You have your pride, you have your prejudice. Right. She sees that he's prejudiced and she goes, well, I would never stoop to his level. And his mom's like, but he's got £10,000 per year. Right. And she doesn't want that. And her mom just can't even understand it because she's not thinking at that level. She's just thinking, we're going to be sent to the poorhouse if your father dies and you haven't been married, that sort of a thing. Right. So that falls apart right at the beginning. Right. And, he's, she's like, no, he's judging us, we don't need this, that sort of a thing. Bingley, on the other hand, which is why I think he's a better guy, is just, my wife says I'm a lot like him. Very optimistic, super sweet. He just, any woman that he's with, he just gives them all his attention and just looks them in the eye and just loves them. And it's not even like in a creepy sort of way. We get those characters too. Right. Bingley is he's just great. He's a really great guy. Elizabeth's not really interested in him because he's also not like a high thinker, that sort of thing. He's just a really nice guy, and he's pretty good at business and that sort of thing. But, and the mom is less keen on him because doesn't have this noble family. He's just like a businessman. That's where he got his money. So he's a little bit lower, but he is wealthy. And so she's like, well, if it doesn't work out with Darcy, at least go with Bingley, that sort of a thing.
But
well,
Bingley
anyway,
zoned.
Right. So Elizabeth isn't interested in him either. So she's like, well, we have one more option for you. Their cousin, who's going to inherit the property, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is a vicar, an Anglican priest. And he is just, he's literally the worst. I mean, he is the most annoying character. He can't read any social cues, but he's obsessed with particular things. So he's in his parish is in the patronage of Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And he will go on and on for hours and hours and hours about how wonderful the Lady Catherine de Bourgh and how honored he is to be in her patronage. And this is all, he uses all this flowery language, and you can tell he doesn't actually believe any of this, but he says it. This is the life he lives or whatever. And he'll be like, and she has 300 glazed windows in her house, and that's expensive, and built-in shelves in her closets, And so she'll like this is how he's trying to impress Elizabeth, like talking about someone else's house and be like, yeah, that's the woman I work for. I'm her priest, and he just like, he doesn't listen to her at all. So obviously Elizabeth's thing is like, she wants someone to appreciate her and that sort of thing. So that's not her. Mr. Collins ends up proposing to her. She obviously rejects him. Her parents like calm him down and like, why don't you try again? We'll talk to her first or whatever. And there's this really great scene that just shows the difference between her parents, where Elizabeth's like, no, I'm not gonna accept his proposal. What are you crazy? And her mom's like, do you want me to end up in the poorhouse? You have to do this. Mr. Bennett, tell her to do this. And he goes, well, you've got one choice. Either you reject his proposal and your mother never speaks to you again, or you accept it and I never speak to you again. and it just is such a, like, Jane Austen's wit is just hilarious. So she's so much fun. So she rejects the proposal. And one of her friends, who's of kind of a lower status, ends up accepting a proposal from him because she's like, I'd rather just be comfortable. And then because he doesn't pay attention to her, she's like, he's got a big library, so I'll just read. I'll just read, that's fine. And so, like in one of the movie adaptations or whatever, when she hears that Elizabeth rejected his proposal, she has this look on her face like, oh, I guess I have to accept it now. There's one other suitor that comes up in Pride and Prejudice specifically, and he kind of is he's kind of a villain, but you don't know this at the beginning. He's real smooth. He's an officer in the so he's commissioned. He's very handsome. He's good at talking to the ladies. He knows poetry and stuff like that. So Elizabeth initially thinks that he's great, and he starts telling the story about Darcy. He starts slandering Darcy, saying that like Darcy's father had promised, like, the main character, or this character that we're talking about, his name is Wickham. He was the son of the gardener for Darcy's estate. And they had the gardener and Mr. Darcy had Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy had a very good relationship. And Mr. Wickham claims that Darcy had promised his dad that he would take care of his family and that sort of thing when he died, because I guess he was sick and he died or something like that. So the younger Wickham, his dad is not alive at the time of the book, but he claims that this promise had been made, and that one of the ways that he was going to do that is that he was going to use some money from Mr. Darcy to go to seminary and then to come back and to be the priest for the parish there. And that didn't work out. And so Mr. Wickham blames Darcy for reneging on the promise. And so he's telling Elizabeth this whole thing, and he says, that's why I had to join the army, because it was the only option I had left. I wanted to go be a priest, and he took that away from me. And so she's like, oh, this is terrible. So she starts being upset with Darcy, more upset than she was, because he was judging her.
Right.
And so you start being like, oh, wow, Wickham, I'm so sorry that this happened to you, that sort of a thing. And so they start getting together and that sort of thing. Well, come to find out that Wickham squandered the money. He went to Oxford to go to seminary. He squandered the money. He partied, he gambled at horse races and stuff like that. And so that's why it didn't work out. And he was like, look, I'm not going to give you any more money to go squander it. I gave you the money that I promised you to go to seminary. You were going to come back and be our priest, and you didn't do that. Right. So I'm not. What do you expect me to do? Well, he kept holding that against him and that sort of a thing. Well, he ends up seducing one of Elizabeth's younger sisters, ones that were very young and had just and he convinces one of them to elope with him. Going back to the shame-based culture, this would ruin the family, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
By this point, though, Darcy has started realizing that Elizabeth's value. And he starts realizing she kind of breaks the rules, but she's really great. She's really smart. Right. She is beautiful. She has some money, that sort of a thing. I kind of like her, right? And all that had been happening at this time, Darcy goes and talks to his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and he kind of tells her, hey, what his plan is. Because when you have a family like this, you do have to get things kind of approved by things. You see this in the royal family, where the king has to approve any marriages within the royal family. Same sort of thing was happening in the nobility, because they were concerned about keeping the family estate together, right? And so if it was an unfit marriage, they'd be like, no, you can't do it. This is where the I object, thing in the weddings comes from. It's because you're thinking about the stability of the family generationally.
Exactly.
And she, of course, goes, no, this family is not noble. They're not very wealthy. They're not respectable. And look how the mother and the two daughters, get drunk and at the parties and stuff like that. And they're, the two girls are just boy crazy, and they're, trying to dance with all these officers. And that's like, they're not a respectable family. They're kind of like on the cusp there, but because Darcy's family is noble and these ones aren't, she's like, no, you're not going to do that. Lady Catherine de Bourgh actually comes to Elizabeth and tells her, hey, you cannot accept any proposal from him.
Right.
And she basically is like, because you suck. Right. And Lady Catherine de Bourgh is like, she's worse than Mr. Collins. Like, she's so prideful. She's so prejudiced. Right. Well, Elizabeth, at this point, this works to make Elizabeth be like hell. What do you mean? I can't accept this proposal. I'm going to accept the proposal. Right. And there's a proposal coming. Like, this comes out of the blue. That sort of a thing.
Right.
Darcy loves Elizabeth now. He kind of realizes this has happened over a year and that sort of a thing. And so he hears about the elopement, right? And of course, this young woman, they've probably consummated, that sort of a thing, but they haven't had an official marriage, that sort of a thing. Because he had just duped her, because that's the kind of guy he is. And so he goes up to find them, and he gives Colonel Wickham, Mr. Wickham, like £10,000, and he says, I will give you this money if you marry this woman and then leave, because you have ruined her life, and I care about this family, and I'm not going to let you do that. Right. And he does this privately. This is you start seeing some of these like Christ-like kind of sacrificial themes here. Like Darcy does this privately. He forsakes his family to do this, because he cares, he loves the Bennet family, right? And he wants to care for this woman. And he doesn't actually really even intend to tell Elizabeth that this happened. He's just going to kind of come back and it's all going to be solved. Word gets out that Darcy did that, and Mr. Bennet is like, thank you. Like Elizabeth, I think, finds out about it because her dad's like, yeah, and if it had, our family would have been ruined if it hadn't been for the generosity of that Darcy. And she's like, what generosity? And this is when she starts realizing, like, she learns about Wickham and how, and that sort of thing. Darcy explains the whole situation about Oxford and that sort of a thing. And so she kind of starts falling in love with him too. And then because she was told by Catherine de Bourgh, you can't marry him, she's like, well, yeah, I'm going to marry him. That sort of thing. So they end up getting married. Bingley ends up getting married to the other sister, Jane. And there's this great part at the end or whatever, where the father is kind of giving them blessings. And he basically just says, Bingley and Jane are very optimistic people. They're very naive, super friendly, that sort of thing. And he gives them some blessing that's like, I pray that you'll be so generous you'll not have any money left or something like that, or because he just recognizes they just have that heart or whatever, but it was great. It's been a few years since I've read that particular one, but it was really fun. So you have these ideas, you have shame, you've got honor, you've got this structure here that really paints a really nice picture of what's going on. And then you get these kind of Christ-like themes of kind of forsaking your family for goodness and truth. You get, you kind of touch on, not telling lies about your neighbor, that sort of a thing. Right. And you also get this idea that sort of attacks the class structure, but in a way that doesn't tear it down. Like I said, it's not Marxist commentary. Like she's like Jane Austen herself grew up in this world. She lives in this world, and this world makes her writing possible, right? That's her woman's craft, is writing these novels, you know? And so there's a love for it, but it's a love that like wants to point out there are some flaws here. And the flaws being the people that don't understand what their duty is.
Exactly.
Just wanting to kind of impress people, just wanting to, you know, show things off. That theme particular of like people not understanding their role is a very constant theme throughout the thing. One of the common sort of villains in all of these books is the encumberment of the property, because people don't understand what the money is actually for, why they've been given this estate, right? So that's kind of the characters see that as a villain. The other thing is this. The other thing is like the role of women and, you know, the money that they have and that sort of a thing. So there's always this sort of looming, they need to get married or else they're going to be really poor.
Right.
So we'll get into that. One of the next books that I really like, and it's actually I think it's my wife's favorite of them all. And the movie adaptations are usually pretty good of it or whatever, but it's Emma. And Emma is a really interesting character because she's kind of just debuted. I think she's like 18, 19, that sort of a thing. Her mother has died, and her father, again, another probably autistic character. Emma's probably autistic as well. And she and her father become super obsessed with like knowing the names and the history of the places and that sort of thing. They do this because they want to follow the rules really well.
Right.
You know, they're like, oh, that's so-and-so. You have to talk to so-and-so in this way because they're of this rank, you know? And so they have these lists of barons and baronesses, you know, that memorize and whatnot. Her father is also a hypochondriac. He's always worried about chills, and like, you know, in the middle of summer, he'll be you know, bundled up, and he'll have a fire going, and he'll have his servants moving panels and that sort of a thing. And he has come to really rely on the companionship of his daughter since his wife died. And because his wife died, he's super protective of her. He doesn't want her leaving the house, that sort of a thing. Emma and her father, the Woodhouses, their name is Woodhouse. They are neighbors to a nobleman, Mr. Knightley. Mr. Knightley is like probably my favorite man in all of the Jane Austen novels. So he's a nobleman. He's kind of low nobility, but he's very wealthy. He's got a very, very large estate. I forget the name of the estate. But he knows his job. He knows his duty. He's become friends with his neighbors. They're not on his estate, so they're not his duty, but they're neighbors. And so he cares for them and that sort of thing. So when Mr. Woodhouse's wife died, he'd started coming over and become a friend to Mr. Woodhouse. And so he comes over fairly regularly in the book and in the movies to just have a cup of tea with him, smoke a pipe, you know, just talk about things, you know, and whatnot,
right.
talk about the weather. And all this time, he's significantly older than Emma. They're kind of adult friends. Mr. Woodhouse was friends with Mr. Knightley's dad, but Mr. Knightley is kind of old enough to have kind of been, you know, a part of those conversations, and then he inherited the estate, and so now he's Mr. Knightley. But he has seen Emma grow up, and he's come to really kind of love her. And at the beginning of the book, you kind of see this, it's a very kind of brotherly, sisterly relationship, and that becomes important later on in the book. So Emma, being autistic, misses a lot of the social cues and that sort of a thing. And she starts kind of insulting characters. So she becomes friends with this orphan girl who's at this girl's school. And this, you know, she's a beautiful young girl. She's very smart, but she has no known history because she's an orphan. And Emma, being of a higher class, doesn't understand that. Like, I mean, she knows the rules and that sort of a thing, but she starts interacting with her as if they're of the same social class and giving her advice that would work for someone in her social class, but it wouldn't work for this woman. For instance, Emma is very wealthy, and because their property is not encumbered, she can actually inherit the estate. Unlike in Pride and Prejudice, where the girls couldn't inherit it, Emma can, because it's not encumbered. So she's like, well, I don't need to get married. The reason you would get married in a time like this is so that you can be taken care of. Well, I'm just going to be fine. I don't need to get married. And so she's kind of trying to convince her friend, you should be really, really choosy. Like if you're going to get married, you should only get married to the best of guys. Well, that's not an option she really has because she's poor. She has no history.
Right.
If anybody proposes to her, it's going to be a good thing. And just kind of before the book started, before she shows up and becomes friends with Emma, she spent the summer working on this farm with one of Mr. Knightley's tenants. And she kind of fell in love with one of the farmers, but she doesn't, nothing happens, there's no proposal, that sort of a thing. She then comes to become a governess at some girls' school or something like that. And that's where she meets Emma. And so, so she's talking about she briefly talks about, oh, there's this farmer that I like. And, and she's like, oh, a farmer. Well, you can do better than that. You're beautiful. You're smart. You can do better than that. And this girl's like, you're right. I can do better, and so she starts, getting really haughty. And so then there's this priest. Priests are often a kind of a villain character, not necessarily a villain character, but like you don't like them in Jane Austen novels. I do wonder if there's something with that. Well, actually, there is something with that. So the Church of England has all sorts of problems and has from the very beginning.
Right.
Because there's a kind of a strange attachment with the Church of England to the nobility. A lot of times there would be this thing where like priesthoods would be given as favors, like, oh, I like you. So yeah, your son can be, we talked about it in Pride and Prejudice. That's why Wickham was initially offered, hey, go to seminary, come back, be the priest, that sort of thing. It was a kind of a family favor. And because you have that sort of a thing, I think Jane Austen was like, there are a lot of people that don't actually love the gospel. They don't actually want to be a priest, but this is just a comfortable living. Being a country priest in a wealthy neighborhood is probably a pretty comfortable existence,
Yeah. Kind of a dream job, right?
Kind of a dream.
You get to read books all the time, do theology, live
get
in
invited
the country.
to people's houses, that sort of thing. So hey, I'll do it. If any British nobility want to make me their priest, I will do that for you. I will make that sacrifice.
I'll sacrifice my.
So the priest in this one, the vicar in this one, is a man named Mr. Elton, and Mr. Elton also is a coxcomb. He's one of these guys that just is like, oh, I'm the priest, and he knows he's handsome. He is a handsome guy, that sort of thing. In a lot of the movies, he's fairly handsome. Well, anyway, so this girl is like, oh, I'm attracted to him. Maybe I can go for him. He lives in this big house, and that sort of a thing. And so she tells Emma, and Emma's like, oh yeah, that'd be perfect for you. That'd be above your station. That'd be really great. So she kind of gets her hopes up and that sort of a thing. Well, Mr. Elton one night at a party kind of arranges for him to be in a carriage with Emma as they come home from the party. And he proposes to Emma. And Emma is like, but what about my friend? And he's like, your friend? Why would I even think about your friend? She's nobody. And of course, she already didn't really like him because she wasn't planning on getting married anyway. And she, didn't think he was great. And now he insulted her friend. And so she's super upset. And so she tells him to get out of the carriage and walk home. So he does. Anyway, the priest is, upset by this, and he runs off to Bath, and he finds some woman to marry who's very wealthy. And so, he's going to be super comfortable, but she's super vain. And so they come back, and she's like, she's awful. She's awful. And the two of them are just like the worst people and that sort of thing. And they come back later, especially in one of the movie adaptations. Emma's all upset about this. She goes to her friend, Mr. Knightley, who I said was like a big brother.
Right.
And she's really upset about this and that sort of thing. And Mr. Knightley's like, why would you get her hopes up like that? She has no chance of marrying that far above her station. She's an orphan. And he's not saying this in the way that like Lady Catherine de Bourgh from Pride and Prejudice was saying, like she's a nobody. He's aware of the structure. He's like, this is just an impossibility. You are doing a disservice to her. And I know for a fact that one of my tenants is head over heels for her. And Emma's offended by that. She's like, but this girl is such a wonderful woman. Like, why would you have her be a farmer? And he's like, why would you think of a farmer that way? This man has been farming on this property for like 800 years. That's a good living. And that's probably the best that she can get. And if he loves her, why would you discourage that? Right. So here he is, he's caring for his tenant who came to him and was like, hey, he actually went to Mr. Knightley to ask for permission. Feudalism, right? He was like, hey, I would like to marry this woman. And the reason that you would do that is because Knightley has an incentive to make sure that that farm will continue to be profitable. So if he's going to go marry someone that's going to steal his money or is going to, make the farm less productive, he would say no to that.
Right.
But he says, no, I give you my full blessing. This is wonderful. And then when he tells Emma that, she's like, no, that's not. So because she's gotten into this girl's head, no, you shouldn't marry below your station, or, well, it still is above her station. You shouldn't marry low. You shouldn't marry at your station. Right. You need to marry way up here. She rejects the proposal. And the farmer is devastated. And he goes back to Knightley and he says, I'm so upset. Right? This to me, this is why I love Knightley. He's like such a beautiful example of like what feudalism could look like in the modern day.
Right.
He cares genuinely about his tenants, and his tenants know this. And they can go to him and say, I just proposed to a woman and it really upset me that she said no.
Right.
Right? Like, who would think about going to your landlord and saying, I just proposed to this woman and she said no? But he goes to his landlord and expects to be comforted, because that's what a landlord does.
We've talked about this in that in our Facebook group, in your Facebook group.
Yes.
We've talked about the fact that, like, I get why people hate their landlords. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not trying to say, like, your landlord is probably a dick. Okay. Like,
yes.
So I get why you don't like him. However, one of the things that I think makes feudalism so much better, and you and I have talked about this so many times, but it's like in feudalism, your lord has so much more riding on being actually a good person and actually caring about you.
He can't just replace you.
Exactly. He can't just replace you. He can't kick your family out to turn your house into an Airbnb, because then there's nobody to actually care for the land.
Right.
And the land is his wealth in a lot of ways.
Right. So and he realizes that wealth is not just for him. Right.
Right.
It's for his children,
like
and that's what we were talking about
earlier.
And he sees this. This is why I love Knightley. He's such a great guy, and he cares enough for Emma that he's willing to tell her, like, that was really dumb. That was really mean. He does this another time. They all go on like a hike somewhere. There's this beautiful view like on the other side of the county, and so they arrange carriages to go take them for a picnic and that sort of a thing. And they bring with them this woman who, why can't I remember her name? But anyway, she again, another probably autistic character, doesn't know a lot of the social cues, but she knows these rules and she knows how, and she pays a lot of attention to them or whatever. But she never got married. She doesn't have a lot of money. As she's gotten old, she's probably like in her 40s now and that sort of thing. As she's gotten older, her money has even decreased further. Her mother lives with her, so she's having to use some of her money to take care of her mother, whose money is even more depleted by that point. They both live in like a 1-bedroom apartment above a shop, downtown or whatever. And Emma doing the thing that a noble family would do. They're I think they're barons and that sort of thing. Often brings this woman food and befriends her and has conversations with her. Like, there are these elements here that just the structure, even though Emma might not think to do these sorts of things because it's expected of someone in her status to do these sort of things, to care for the poor, they go and do that. Right. And so this structure that Jane Austen is writing about, I find personally beautiful, because it's very Christian. We talk about the landlords caring for them. We talk about, caring for the widows and the poor and that sort of thing. This is a much bigger thing. Like in Russian nobility, there's a really great book. There's a really great book called like Love and Happiness or something like that was written around the same time in Russia. And you have these huge elements of this. Like there's this woman that like it's her duty to go and bring food to the poor. And she does it on like religious holidays and stuff like that, you know? So it's like, I mean, this is, you know, Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, St. Stephen's Day. You know, this is the thing that you would put on a feast for your servants and for the poor, and you would invite them in out of the cold, that sort of thing. That's why it's called Boxing Day, because you box up your feast from Christmas and then you serve that to the poor, and you have dances and stuff like that. Like there's this element here, and Jane Austen is writing this, and I just find this world much more Christian. You know,
it is,
even though you have these priests that are not great. You know, like, but this is, this is a reflection of the church. I mean, even in Orthodoxy, there are priests that are not great. Yeah, this is just the thing. That doesn't mean that the church is not beautiful, and the world that the church builds around itself is not beautiful.
Right.
And that's why I love this world. And I love characters like Knightley who really exemplify this. So they go on this picnic to this beautiful, you know, this hill somewhere. It's supposed to be the best view in the county, that sort of a thing. And the older woman who never got married, like I said, she's kind of autistic. Like she's saying a bunch of things. This woman talks all the time and she gossips. This is part of why Emma likes going to go be with her, because she likes gossip and she likes hearing what's going on. This woman gossips and she kind of talks nonstop or whatever. Emma at one point gets kind of frustrated because she's interested in this one guy that's with them and is wanting to kind of talk to him or whatever, but this woman keeps interrupting. And she makes some comment about how like, oh, well, you never, you know, something about, like she makes fun of how much she talks. I forget exactly the phrase. Well, this really upsets the woman. She feels really embarrassed. And Knightley comes to her and he said in the movie, you know, in the movie, it's great. He just goes, "Badly done, Emma, badly done." But he explains, she's like, well, it's not insulting. I'm just speaking, you know, she's below my station. I can speak about her however he wants. And Knightley goes, "No, that's not how this works. You shamed this woman. She already is living in shame because she never got married. She's very poor, right? And you should know that as someone who's been blessed with much more, it is your duty to build her up as much as you can. Maybe you can't give her all this money and that sort of a thing. Maybe you can't find her a husband, but you can build her up and make her feel valued in this community because she's your friend. And she's below you. And it's your duty as someone that's above her to build her up, to use your status to build other people up." And he has this whole speech for her. And he's talking to her
so much.
And he's talking to her like an older brother. And that's where he's like, "Badly done, Emma." You know, and it's this kind of beautiful, and it gets Emma to really start thinking about it. And so she goes to apologize by bringing her a ham. And
that's
she apologized.
An excellent way to apologize.
I agree.
That's if anybody ever wants to apologize to me,
I accept ham.
I accept ham as a means of apology.
So this is a real turning point for Emma, because she starts sort of realizing, wait a second, like there are people that I care about. It's more than just being rich. Like she stops being as much of a coxcomb, you know, and that sort of thing. And so Knightley ends up proposing to her. He's like, "Look, I've loved you pretty much your whole life. And once you became a woman," you know, he's not that much old. I think he might have been like 16 when she was born. So, you know, like today, that's a little bit of an age gap. Back then, it really wasn't. So he's, you know, so that's why he had this kind of older brother relationship with her. And then once she became a woman, it kind of shifted. So she accepts his proposal, which is out of the blue for Emma, but it's because she had this major character shift. And it was because of the coaching of her friend, Mr. Knightley, who really understands his role.
Right.
And so she becomes a better person because of this. But remember, I said that Emma's dad is a hypochondriac and he's obsessed with his daughter, very protective, and he really relies on her friendship. Because he's kind of a hypochondriac, like he has his house the way that he trusts his house, right? But he doesn't really like he doesn't really leave the house ever. Only very rarely for like a very big party. And even then he's uncomfortable. He doesn't want to leave his house, and he doesn't want Emma to leave his house. And Emma, of course, would, because she's marrying Mr. Knightley, who has a much bigger house down the road, and he has this estate. Knightley says, "You know what? I care about you and I care about your father. as long as your father's alive, we're going to go and occupy your house.
Oh, I love
We're going to
that.
we're going to live with your father because that's what he needs. And I know you love your father. I love your father too. And we're going to do that together. And they agree to do that. In one of the movies, and I don't remember if this speech is in the book, but in one of the movies, it's one of the older, like from the late 90s or whatever. And I don't remember it in the other ones. They at their wedding scene, he's throwing this feast and he invited all of the tenants, right? So again, he loves his tenants and he considers them part of his family, right? This is the beauty of nobility when it's properly understood. He considers his tenants to be part of his family and he invites them to the wedding feast with his bride. And there's dancing and that sort of thing. Mr. Elton and his wife, who are total vain, they come to the party and she's like, oh, why? How garish? Why would they invite the tenants? And someone rebukes her and it's like, why wouldn't he invite the tenants?
Right.
They live here. They're part of this estate. There's a party on the estate. Right. You're going to invite the tenants.
Exactly.
And they just don't understand this. They like go off and be like, oh, that sort of thing. Mr. Knightley then gets up and he explains to them, he says, hey, I want you to know there's going to be some big changes. Obviously, I got married. That's a big change. Right. I think he even says something like, God willing, we're going to have children. That will be a big change. So it's just beautiful. But then he says, and I want you to know, because I love this family and I love her father, just because of his living arrangement, we're going to go move to live with him. And it's probably going to be for a few years. But I want you to know I am still here. I'm not going to become an absentee landlord. I'm just down the road. If you need anything, just like we've had before, you can come and talk to me and I will help you with it. And he says, I believe that the Lord is going to bless this estate and bless you guys through this estate the way that he has blessed me with my bride. And it's just this beautiful speech. It's like, it was such a great scene. And I don't remember if it was in the book, but it was certainly in this like late 90s adaptation on the movie. Right. I loved it. I loved it so much. And then also, Emma was able to convince her friend, hey, this farmer is going to come back and propose to you again. Mr. Knightley convinced him, try one more time. I think it'll work this time. Go ahead and propose to her. And Emma says, yeah, you should accept this proposal. I'm sorry. And, apologizes to her for leading her on and that sort of a thing. Right. And she has to kind of get around some of the programming that she had done of her, because she initially is like, well, but that's marrying below my. And she's like, oh, it really isn't. This is, he's a really great guy. He really loves you. And honestly, that's all that you can ask for, and she she's able to give this speech because she realizes that's what she loves about Mr. Knightley. She doesn't need Mr. Knightley's money. She's wealthy in and of herself. She marries him even though she doesn't need to, because she realizes there's more to marriage than love, which at the beginning of the movie, all she thought about was the money. Well, I don't need the money, so why would I get married? Now she's getting married because she loves him. They also happen to be just very wealthy. Like now they have 2 estates, so, but she has this realization that is separate from the money. And that's why she's able to give this speech to her friend, and her friend accepts the proposal and they get married and they live happily ever after. Right. And so, but all of this happened because you have this man who is just very, he knows his role as servant and steward, and he's able to guide and coach his tenants and his neighbors and his friends and really be a pillar of this community. And continue to be a very Christ-like servant who truly loves his bride and is willing to compromise and willing to give up, his, it would be much easier to live at his house. It's a much bigger house. He's got more servants, that sort of a thing. But they moved to the smaller house because he loves her. And, this is, of course we're like, oh, boo-hoo, it's still a much bigger house than any of us have, but it's still a sacrifice. And it does make his life more difficult because he does have to actively manage this estate 5 miles down the road. So, that's a journey. He's going to have to he has a commute now, but he's committed to that because he received this inheritance and he loves his wife. Exactly. I don't think we probably don't have time to go into like more, like in depth, like go through all of the plot points. There's, she wrote like 15 books and they're all fantastic. They all have different themes. There's a lot of great movie adaptations of almost all of them. Like the BBC just churns them out like, every 5 years or something like that. So there's a lot of great ones. There's some not so great ones, but even the not so great ones are fun, to watch. My wife and I are actually thinking about watching. There's a Bollywood version of Pride and Prejudice that we're thinking about watching like tomorrow night. I haven't seen it yet. She has. She enjoys it. So I was like, oh, that'd be fun. We'll do that.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's such a fun world. And you have a lot of these themes. Like you have these very impressive character growths. You have people kind of leading them through them. You have some really neat kind of pivot points. She does a lot with like, she'll initially introduce a character and you're like, ooh, I like him or I hate him. And then by the end of it, you have a completely different idea of what they're about. And one of the things I like about it is that, like modern novels, especially when it's like a woman is the main character, which all of Jane Austen's books, a woman is the main character. She's a woman. She understands how to write for women. That makes the most sense. But none of her women are flawless. Right. And I think this is really, really important because that's kind of the whole theme of what she's going with. She's like, yeah, this is kind of a beautiful world, but it's got some flaws.
Right.
And if with proper guidance, with minute changes, with adjustments in attitude, right, we can tweak this and make it much more beautiful, which is why almost all of her books end with the main character getting married and it turning out to be a very good thing. And so in this day, when we have just a lot of books where you have the strong independent woman who don't need no man, and that's how the book ends, or you have the man who's just selfish or, bloodthirsty, or he's weak and he, is selfish and that sort of thing. Like, these are kind of the tropes that you get. I find it very refreshing to have a world that has a very, where the author loves the world that she lives in. And she loves it enough to criticize it to make it better, not just to complain about it. And within this world, she has these characters that come to similar criticisms, or perhaps they exemplify things that are being criticized. Right. And they themselves give those things up in order to become better people by the end of it. Right. So unlike reading Lord of the Rings or something like that, or reading Narnia or, Dostoevsky or that sort of thing, some of these more epic kind of things, there maybe are not quite as strong of like Christ-like themes. So you kind of pitch this as like, where is Christ in these books? Christ is in the church and the structure that the church gives that, and the sort of the ethics that the church teaches us, how to be a steward, how to be a servant, how to give honor to people, right? How to sacrifice when you need this, right? You don't have anybody that's literally giving their life for anybody, at least not that I remember. But you do have a lot of people that make sacrifices because of love. Right. And that's where I see Christ in these books. And you can tell that this world is very important to Jane Austen as she writes these. I had mentioned earlier the emphasis at pivot points in the stories of Candlemas and Michaelmas. And the reason these are pivots goes back or at least 1,000 years that we know of. Those were the days that rent was due, right? It was at the end of harvest and it was before planting, right? I don't know if you know, so we just had Candlemas. It's 40 days after Western Christmas. And there's on February 2nd, right? In America here, that's Groundhog Day. Why is it Groundhog Day? It's because the Puritans needed that day. Candlemas is a pivot point in the winter that starts letting you realize when spring is coming. And in England at the time, the thought was, if the sun outshines the light of Mary at Candlemas, then winter, you had 6 more weeks of winter, you should hold off on your planting. Right. If the light of Mary in the candles was able to outshine the sun on February 2nd, then it was safe to plant because the worst of winter was over. Mm-hmm. And this actually is it's relatively accurate, right? I think someone had said it's like 33% chance or something like that, which is not terrible. I mean,
Right.
let's be honest, that's not a terrible prediction as far as like the weather goes. Our meteorologists get it worse than that. But I think there's a fundamental kind of difference of what they're trying to do, though. They're not being like, will it ever snow again? They're like, it's more of a like, in general, it's going to start getting warmer, so it's probably safe to plant. You're
Right.
probably safe to start tilling up the fields and that sort of a thing. So you're getting things ready so that like by March, you can get things into the ground. If it's sunny on February 2nd, you might want to hold off a week or two, you know,
Right.
and that's what it was. This was such an accurate thing. It lasted for like 1,000 years, so that the Puritans wanted to bring that forward, but of course they couldn't keep the Marian feast. So
Right.
they replaced it with a groundhog. And they weren't the first to replace the feast itself with like an animal of some sort. I forget what the British counterpart to the groundhog is. It's not a groundhog, but it's something that burrows, and they would use that and that sort of a thing. That goes back fairly far too. And it's even, you know, I think even some of the more Catholic celebrations would do both, you know, that sort of thing.
Right.
But anyway, so these are pivot points. You know, Michaelmas is in November.
Boo.
I know. We spent like an hour talking about how terrible they were in their last one. So Michaelmas was the end of the harvest, right? And you know, I'm sure if they had focused more on Knightley in the book, he probably threw some sort of party, because that's what you did. You've been doing that
Right.
for like 1,000 years. You throw a party on Michaelmas, and it's one of the biggest feasts of the year. You know, shy of Christmas, you know, like,
Right.
and then Lady Day, or Candlemas, or the Feast of the Purification of Mary and the Presentation of our Lord on February 2nd, was right before you're going to start doing that. So Rent was due at those
Right.
times. And so in Jane Austen's mind, these are pivot points in her stories, because they're pivot points in the life of the Christian. They're
Right.
pivot points in the life. And so you just see this world in which the church just sort of permeates everything. The structure, the rules, the ethics, the calendar itself, you know, Christmas shows up in several of them, you know, it's a big deal. And I love also that, like, you know, there is the priest is always a present character, whether you
Right.
like him or not. He's always a present. He's part of their lives. Right. In the 2020 adaptation of Emma, which, as far as adaptations goes, was not great. I think they ruined some things. It's a beautiful movie. The cinematography, the costumes, the acting is actually pretty good. One of the things that was really weird about it, that actress who plays Emma, I guess, can cause a nosebleed on command. And so she's like, I'm doing that. And so she does it at one point. Like, it's like, we're like, oh, okay, whatever. But one of the things they did well in that adaptation was the soundtrack is just so much fun. And it's just these, you know, like, you know, Anglican hymnody, and which, you know, as a Lutheran that's adopted a lot of that Anglican hymnody, our church has over the years. I've come to love a lot of that. So, like, you know, I think it's the opening scene. They have the hymn "How Firm a Foundation," and it's sung in just this like folk singing way. I listen to that song, like that recording, like all the time, because I think it's just beautiful.
That song
so
was
I think
actually written by a Catholic.
I'm sure it was, right? Yeah. So a lot of good ones are. Silent Night was written by a Catholic, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of great Catholic hymns in our Lutheran hymnal.
How Firm a Foundation was actually written by a Catholic who wrote it because it's actually if I can find it, I'll send it to you. But most people never sing the full song. Most hymnals don't have the full song. The last verse in the song is actually a prayer to Mary to convert England back from the Anglican
I love
schism.
I love this. This is fantastic. My wife and I think that was the closing hymn at our wedding. We just loved it.
Oh, I love that.
So yeah.
Oh.
So we thought that was really great. So you know, there's so much more of Jane Austen we could go into. If you want to dive into this, I mentioned a YouTube channel, Ellie Dashwood. She's fantastic. She's a Native American woman, which is kind of interesting. That really loves Jane Austen. She's also has some disabilities, so as part of her channel is that. But she does a lot of great talk about like that era and themes within the books and that sort of thing. She does a really great job. Very fascinating.
What is she called? Ellie?
I think it's Ellie Dashwood.
Oh, found it.
Yep. And so she's very nice. She's kind of soft spoken, but I've found her videos entertaining. If you're reading the books and you're kind of missing details and that sort of a thing, Course Hero does some really fantastic summaries of every chapter, and then the theme, like they do a summary of the book and they talk about the theme. So Course Hero has almost all of her books where they have like 5-minute videos for every chapter. That was very helpful for me as I was trying to read these really quickly so that I could quickly talk to my wife about them. Those I found very helpful. Peter Lightheart, who's a Presbyterian, I think you're familiar with him. He actually wrote a book about Jane Austen novels.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I haven't read it. I've heard it's very good though. And he talks about a lot of these.
Presbyterian, I was part of his church.
That's right. You had mentioned that. I've read a couple of his books and I like his books. So I imagine this one is pretty good as well. I haven't read it. But I've heard good things about it. People have recommended it. I haven't watched it. Or I haven't read it. Other resources, like they're 200-year-old books, so all of them are on LibriVox. If you're gonna listen to them, I really love the recordings by a woman named Karen Savage. Karen Savage is a voice actor. I know nothing else about her other than the fact that she reads these books really well.
That's awesome.
So you can find those on LibriVox, I think YouTube, that sort of a thing. But yeah, I really like her readings of it. So if you're more of an audiobook listener, listen, you can listen to her. She does a very good job. But just read them. They're fun. They're really fun books. It's a great way for like guys. I'm sure that your wife is at least familiar with the books if she isn't like obsessed with them like my wife is.
Right.
She probably would appreciate you reading at least, one of them. Pride and Prejudice is a good one. She's probably read. Sense and Sensibility is another really popular. We didn't talk about Sense and Sensibility. There's some really great characters in there. The kind of the main man there is a man named Colonel Brandon, and he's a little older, but you get that maturity that's really kind of cool to see, and he becomes very helpful to the ladies. Emma was good, has some really great characters. Northanger Abbey there's a lot of Persuasion, I think, is one of my wife's favorite ones, and that one actually has some there's some loss and regret involved. And so there's some neat kind of themes in that one as well. They're all wonderful, and you can't go wrong with almost any of them. Sense and Sensibility is the oldest. They're written in their time. So like the things that are happening at that time when the book is written, you see that happening in the book. Pride and Prejudice is a little bit later. But wonderful books. There's a biopic about Jane Austen called Becoming Jane that I've heard is very good. I haven't watched it, but I've heard that it's a good movie. And that will, if you want to learn more about Jane Austen, I've heard that that's a good movie to watch. And then there's countless books. Like I said, the BBC is always doing something about Jane Austen. That's their thing, so,
right.
Lot of opportunities if you want to dive into this world. But I can't recommend enough just diving into it. Sense and Sensibility is like 150 pages. It's not a very long book. And you can read it, and there's some great characters in there. That was the first one that I read because it was the first one she wrote, so I was like, well, I'm going to read these chronologically, obviously. And then I started reading them based off of my wife saying, oh no, this one's really good. You got to read this, I do want to throw this out there. So
yeah,
in the last episode where we talked about Christian community, that sort of thing, I mentioned the church, like a mile down the road from where I go. They have great community. That's right. One of the communities they have once a month, they have this books and beer event where guys come, they have taps in their basement, and then they talk about a book.
Oh, nice.
It's the first Sunday of every month. And so this Sunday on Super Bowl, during the Super Bowl, they're having their book club. So, which is fun, funny in and of itself. Last year, the book that they were discussing during the Super Bowl was a Jane Austen novel, which I just think it's just the best. It's just fantastic. I don't really have anything against football. I enjoy football. I enjoy watching it. I'm probably not going to watch the Super Bowl just because I don't have TV. So, it's just a hassle to do it at this point.
Right.
But it cracks me up that they're like, not only are we going to have our book club, our men's book club on the Super Bowl, we're going to read a girl book. Like, it's just kind of funny to me. I just wanted to throw that out there because I've been laughing about it all year.
I freaking love that.
It's so much fun.
I also have nothing against football. People have probably seen my Chicago Bears mug, but I don't watch football for the same reason you don't. I don't have a TV. If there was like a Chicago Bears sports bar around here, might go there just to like for the camaraderie. As a Bears fan, for the commiseration, right? Right. Yeah. Just misery loves company.
Right. When I do watch football, I'm a Buffalo fan. My dad grew up in Buffalo. They've never been to the Super Bowl, or they went 4 years in a row, but they never won, so,
so you feel my pain.
I feel your pain. I understand it. So, well, hopefully I piqued y'all's interest in at least diving into the world of Jane Austen. If you've already been in the world, I hope that you go back because it's such a fun world. And I love going back into it with my wife. It's really fun. And it's been really fun to bond with her in that way and to join in something that has brought her so much joy. So if you are a man, that's a great way to connect with your wife. I mean, like that's kind of my pitch. Not only were they just fun to read, but then also your wife's probably going to love that you read them.
Right.
And, so it's just really fun. So hopefully you found this interesting tonight. So.
Absolutely. Not only do I love it, but I want to share, you had mentioned like one of the things I love about your talk there is you talked about the Mr. Knightley character and how this is such a good example of what we're talking about when we talk about when you and I talk about believing in feudalism, we don't mean that like, oh, we're cool with slavery.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is that we believe that something like what Jane Austen is describing is beautiful. And I want to share a quote that I was searching for while you were talking about that, and then I finally found it. It's from Tsar Nicholas II, my patron saint. He said, "The higher a person's position is in society, the more should he help others without ever reminding them of his position."
Yes.
So you can see how, like, this is the orthodox conception of what societal structure is supposed to look like. People like Mr. Knightley who are able to use their social standing to uplift others just by virtue of the fact that they are in this standing.
Yes.
And they don't have to remind other people. They're not like the cockbrushes or whatever.
The coxcombs. Yeah.
The coxcombs. They're not like them because those people are people who, they're like our wealthy people in America. Our wealthy people in America just want to buy. They want status symbols. They want, they want to constantly lord it over you that they're wealthier than you. They'll kick your family out and turn your house into an Airbnb.
Yep.
And those people are trash human beings. But it's also, those people are very broken and it's sad and we should pray for them. Even though it's difficult to pray for them, I know, but pray for them nonetheless.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is people like Mr. Knightley. They give us a good example of exactly what Christianity teaches us to order society. Exactly what, to use another term, exactly what Christendom is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Christendom is a specific term. A lot of people misuse the term Christendom. It's a specific term for the way a society is supposed to be ordered according to Christianity.
Yeah, it's not just Western Europe in the Middle
Ages. Right, exactly.
That's how most people use it. It is it is a Christian society. It is Christ's kingdom come, which is what we pray every day. We always pray that. And Jane Austen paints us a world in which you see glimpses of this, more so than we do in our current world.
That's right.
And this is why you and I rail against modernity, because we have jettisoned that intentionally.
Mhm.
So I
Exactly.
drew a nice picture of your patron, today. So here's
I
my
saw
drawing
that
of
on your
Tsar
Facebook.
Nicholas. So but
I saw
yep,
that on your Facebook. I
yep,
love it so much.
yep.
That's
So
beautiful.
well, it is 11:30 here, so I'm
Yes.
gonna say goodnight to you guys. I have so much fun hyperfixating on things like this and info dumping. So
And I have so much fun having you on the show. And for everybody out there, thank you so much, Aaron, for
my
joining
pleasure.
us tonight. Thank you guys for watching. And if you enjoyed this, please share this with your friends, especially your hyper testosterone friends who would
Yes.
never read Jane Austen, so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.